very much appreciative of this opportunity to speak to our American friends and to the two other speakers. Canada has, as each with every country, a unique geographical perspective. We're at best a middle power. That means that we have to react more to events internationally, and that includes China. And our opportunities to shape what happens in Asia are modest. Our national experience has been to not pay much attention to what's happening there, and then to be suddenly drawn into conflict. That was the case on December 8th when we had Canadian troops in Hong Kong. The Japanese invaded. They fought bravely, but were quickly defeated. It was the same in the summer of 1950 when the North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and we found ourselves fighting in Korea. And the same actually after 9/11 when our troops were quickly fighting alongside our US and other allies in Afghanistan. So we have little ability to shape events in Asia, but are profoundly affected by them, both in security and in economic terms. In economic terms, we are, along with Germany, perhaps one of the most heavily dependent countries in international trade. Here are the percentages. Canada, 66% of our GDP is generated by trade. China, 37%, the United States, 24%. So we live or die our prosperity by what happens in terms of our trade. The good news for us, 75% of our exports go to the United States, still the world's largest market where we have very good, although not perfect access. But multiple governments have thought we really need to diversify, and the place to diversify is the largest, fastest growing economy, which is China and other parts of Asia. And that effort has actually fallen apart. It already was running into difficulty in the period before 2018 when our Prime Minister and government were tempted to negotiate a free trade agreement with China. The United States was wary of that, but we persisted, but it became quickly clear that we could not reach common ground. Even the USMEC Treaty of the United States was hard going, but in the case of China, trying to negotiate factors such as labor agreements, environmental standards, human rights, a complete non-starter, the Chinese basically said no way. And to be fair, I think it was always a non-starter that China is going to remake their whole internal system to adjust to a trade agreement with one small foreign power. But the wheels came off completely in December 2018 when Canada, at the behest of an extradition request in the United States, arrested the CFO of Huawei, arguably China's most successful international company, not their largest, but the company with the highest profile that has broad expectations of being an industry leader in high tech. The fact that we picked, the US requested, I guess, the Eastern Court of Manhattan, of New York, chose that as a topic. This was maybe not quite in the Ivanka Trump category, but this is, I would argue, a princess in a sense in the Chinese system, the daughter of the chairman. That family is well known to Xi Jinping and the leadership. Hard for me to imagine someone to detain that would enrage China more. And so from that date flowed immediately some effects. The detention, unwarranted detention of two Canadians, one of whom is known to me, Michael Kovrig, the other Michael Spavor. These two young men were arrested on very serious charges. They now actually charges have been formally laid of espionage. They carry heavy sentences. The article they've been charged with would give them a maximum penalty of life imprisonment. And they've been in prison since December 2018 under very tough circumstances, 6 months of interrogation multiple times each day by the Ministry of State Security, not known for their gentle ways, and with lights on in solitary confinement. They're now in a general population. But I've been in many Chinese jails, not under arrest, I can reassure you, but visiting consular cases. And this is not a place you want to be. Madame Meng, by contrast, wears an ankle bracelet. She's not even under house arrest. She can go to parties, invite friends, and go shopping in Vancouver. That's our judicial system. Those conditions were set by the judge, and they cannot be interfered with. This has plunged the Canada-China relations into the deepest trough that has been in since in Tiananmen. And I was in government at the time, but Tiananmen was a multinational response. It wasn't focused on Canada. course, China is also angry at the United States. But if we proceed, and our Prime Minister just 10 days ago was absolutely clear that we will proceed until the law runs its course, that means we'll be living with this blockage in our relationship for months, potentially years, as is the case with many Western countries. Judicial system is not known by its speedy nature. There are lots of opportunity if you have good lawyers, and Huawei has great lawyers, but this will be drawn out for a long time. So my expectations of normalcy returning are very low. The United States, there is a saying of a former prime minister, the father of a current prime minister, said, when the U.S. catches a cold, we catch pneumonia. So we are profoundly affected what happens. It's not just that trade dependence, but we would ignore our parallel U.S. views. We are literally joined at the hip, a long unguarded border crossing 6,000 kilometers. What happens in America, and that includes down to the details of China policy, affect us very much. America watches closely what we do with China. My institute has an investment tracker that tracks Chinese investment in Canada, and a subscriber is the U.S. Embassy. There is great interest in what we do, and like any great power, they follow the foreign policies of their allies closely. I'd always been in favor of a strong Beijing-Washington relationship because it gave us space. And that meant that even if America might take some market share from us, that general calm in international markets was in our net interest, given our trade dependency. So we watch with anxiety that deterioration. If it becomes a full-blown Cold War, we're not there yet, but we're headed, it seems, in that direction. That will have serious implications for us. There is no doubt who we align with. We have 2 defense treaties in the United States, both NATO and NORAD, and without American protection, Canada will be in an extremely vulnerable position. So we will be by America's side, but that doesn't mean that we welcome the raised tensions. The red lines for us, there cannot be a normalization relationship without the release of the 2 Michaels. China claims no such thing as arbitrary detention. Well, I can think of hundreds. Perhaps you could argue, if you included the Uyghurs, a million exceptions to that. I've served in multiple communist countries on 3 continents, and I'm wary of propaganda. That said, I don't look with enthusiasm at the idea of a Cold War. My experience, the first part of my career, was the previous Cold War. It ended, in my view, in the best way possible. The good guys won, the bad guy lost. Soviet Union went to sleep. But to my mind, there was never any guarantee of that. And I will quote, I won't name, a very senior diplomat who I served with abroad, who was a political appointee of the George Bush administration. He said to me once, when it looked like there might be conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan, he said, Gordon, a war between the United States and China would ruin the 21st century. And when I was in Washington last year, reminded of that, he said he hasn't changed his mind. So I'd argue we want peace, we want to be able to diversify our trade, but we have values. We have a defense relationship we will honor, we'll stand by our US ally, but we would benefit from, as an internationalized country, a more benign international setting, and that includes trans-Pacific links. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I appreciate that. And you came in just a few seconds over time. So Daniela, we turn it over to you.
Well, thank you also. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to join you all virtually. And I am sort of humbled in light of Gordon's long experience in observing foreign relations, because I am, for 20 years, I've been working on domestic politics in China, and I've only come to the discussion of German foreign policy in particular since I had the honor of joining a trip by President Steinmeier, who is obviously not as powerful as the Chancellor Merkel, during his trip to China in 2018. And so most of my observations will focus on the last few years rather than giving a long-term perspective. So Currently, Germany and also Europe realizes that they are in a very tough spot because Washington and Beijing would each like to make Europe a stronger partner, and they feel they are being caught up in a zero-sum game. And so Germany shares concerns of course, with the United States about China, but at the same time, it is also rather reluctant to follow the rather confrontational approach the US has been taking. And this results in seeing possibilities in treating China as a partner and cooperating with China in terms of climate change. Also ideas about free multilateral trading systems, or the trading system supporting its development, and also more recently in terms of digitalization as common interests. And I will, in a moment, I will talk a little bit more about the German perspective, but I think it's helpful for the German case to first talk a little bit more about how Germany fits within the U.S. China relationship. So in terms of public opinion polls, German polls, online polls by YouGov, they support the view that Germans, along with other European citizens, would rather like to stay independent in the US-China trade war and would rather not like to make a choice. Nevertheless, if they have to make a choice, they would probably support the American view. The majority does not want to take any side, though. And in Germany, the supportive US side is only 10%, as low as 10%. In terms of economic interests, China will certainly not replace the United States as Europe's and Germany's most important export market anytime soon. In 2018, the European Union's 27 member states and the UK exported an average of 2.5% of their GDP to the United States, and less than 1% to China. And within Europe in 2018, Germany exported even more, so 3.5% of its GDP to the United States, and in comparison, less 2.8% of its GDP to China. So because Germany's exports to China within Europe play such an important role, Germany also sees itself as playing an important role in trying to address the US-China confrontational relationship and try to resolve some tensions. And Germany is trying to do so during the EU-China summit that has been originally scheduled for September this year, but then has been postponed because of the corona pandemic. And now I'm turning more towards the German view and German goals in terms of its foreign policy towards China. So Germany has just assumed the presidency of the EU Council, and is therefore taking a leadership role in preparing the summit. At the summit, it has two, the European Union has two sets of broader goals. The first one I would call supporting and promoting a sustainable economic development. And here, German businesses recently, especially also during the corona pandemic, have become increasingly worried, but then at the same time they are also supporting Chancellor Merkel's approach that is not confrontational towards China. There have been some attempts by German industry to diversify supply chain as part of the pandemic, but according to some polls, the majority, 77% of surveyed German companies are not considering to move their operations out of China. So, Germans' dependency on especially amongst the German car industry, Volkswagen's, I think about half of Volkswagen's revenue is made in China. Also BMW, Daimler, they also make over 1/3 of their car sales in the People's Republic. And so because of these economic interests, Germany pushes for more reciprocity between the two countries, as German companies have complained that they do not have the same access to the Chinese market as the Chinese companies have to the European market. So they're pushing for a more balanced access to each other's markets. At the same time, they also want to promote further economic development within climate change. Germany's population, as well as its leadership, strongly supports climate change and sort of improving sustainability of businesses. At the same time, in terms of economic concerns in Germany, there is increasing concern about Chinese investment in Europe, especially a hostile takeover in 2016 by the Chinese Midea Group has received a lot of attention. The Midea Group holds 95% of its shares, and has, despite early claims in 2016 and 2018, they have fired the German CEO and have replaced the CEO with a Chinese one. And during the pandemic, there have been widespread fears amongst German industry that Chinese companies would be asset hunting in Germany. And therefore, in April 2020, the German Bundestag agreed to a tougher screening mechanism on non-EU investment in China. None of these measures are directed directly against China, but there's certainly these stories are part of the background. And in addition to promoting economic development, the second aspect of the EU-China summit will be focusing on human rights because Chancellor Merkel was born and raised in East Germany. She also has her personal history has also made her a promoter of pushing for more democracy and human rights and freedom in conversations with China. I have had some personal observations that I'm very happy to share during the discussion about how Germany tries to engage with China in terms of pushing for more democracy and human rights when I was traveling with the German Bundespräsident. But I leave that to the discussion. So Huawei and G5 technology obviously has also been a very important topic in German politics. Especially because there is increasing worry also about not only Chinese investment in Germany, but also increasing German influence, economic influence also in technological influence in Germany. And Chancellor Merkel, along with her grand coalition, they have made the decision to not ban G5 technology and not ban Huawei as a company. The German press interpreted this as a pro-industry move, supporting calls from the industry to not be too confrontational in its relationship with China. From talking to some decision makers who were part of these talks, I learned that the industry arguments have not been brought up during the decision-making process. There have been two arguments made during the discussion. One was that Huawei or G5 technology in particular provided a security risk because Huawei was a Chinese company. The other argument was that G5 technology in general imposes security risks and that therefore security measures should be taken that improve the security standards of the technology. And the second argument has won. And since then, German Bundestag has passed a new Telecommunications Act with a very long list increasing security measures and also asking operators to report to a German regulator And we're going to see how this is going to play out in the future. At the same time, Huawei has also been engaged in court, in German court, and a German court in Düsseldorf has ruled in favor or against the company in favor of a former employee who, under the German or European GDPR law, has been filed a complaint against the company requesting that his data should be made available to him. And unfortunately, the German court has only imposed a fine of 5,000 euros. So from my conversations with Chinese tech industries, they have argued that this only shows them what the actual costs are, financial costs are for Chinese tech companies when they violate European data protection laws. So we're going to see to what extent these measures by German Bundestag are actually going to lead to some implementation on part of Huawei. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. And now we're turning to Andrew Chubb, our double hitter, and talk both about his native Australia and his currently adopted UK. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so thanks to all the organisers for their hard work in putting it together, to Jan and to the committee and partners for the invitation. It's a really great honour to share this virtual stage with such illustrious company. Gordon and Danny are definitely two people that I've looked up to for a number of years in my studies of China, and I'm really looking forward to getting a chance to ask them some questions following their excellent presentations. I am just going to be talking very briefly about both Australia and China and their views, Australia and Britain and their views of China and the US and what's going on in that bilateral. I wanted to, just to save time, wherever possible, I've tried to sort of combine the two by comparing them and trying to draw out the similarities and differences between Australia and Britain's approaches to China and the US-China relationship. So overall, I'd argue that Australia is closer to the US on China than the UK is, primarily because China hasn't really occupied much of the UK's political consciousness so far, at least compared to the situation in Australia, where Australia has been talking and debating intensively about China for several years now. But overall, I'd argue that they're moving all in the same direction. And I'd summarize that direction as a kind of compartmentalized toughening of China policy. Neither of these two countries is interested in a general decoupling, economic decoupling, or in joining an all-out strategic competition. But they are both reassessing and almost certainly going to reduce existing cooperative activities with China in areas like the tech economy and research and development. And in those regards, their policies and their approaches in the general direction really mirror the approach that the US is taking, or aspects of the US approach. So first of all, to give a brief overview of Australia and the UK's current relations with China, politically, Australia is very much in the diplomatic deep freezer over issues ranging from investment to foreign political interference and most recently COVID. There's been no summits since 2015, no ministerial visits since 2018, and since this year, no phone calls even. The PRC ministers aren't picking up phone calls from Australian counterparts. By contrast, the UK-China political relationship, I'd say it's hanging in there, despite the strains that have emerged in the last couple of years. Boris Johnson's recent phone calls that he's had with Xi Jinping this year have featured praises, professions of love for China, praises for China's COVID response, at least most recently in March. But that was before the tabloid press got stuck into China over COVID, before the Hong Kong national security law, And before the PRC's ambassador, Liu Xiaoming, most recently said this week, if you want to make China a hostile country, you'll have to bear the consequences. And he was referring in that case to the possibility that the UK may reverse its decision to allow partial participation of Huawei in the building of its 5G network. So it really remains to be seen whether the UK's political ties with China will survive. But in any case, that's not the totality of relations, because we've seen in Australia, despite the political freeze, trade has continued to grow, most likely because it's dominated by Australia's iron ore sales to China. These are quite important to the PRC. The PRC doesn't have great alternatives available, especially given that Brazil is suffering greatly from the COVID pandemic. So that chunk of the trade relationship, which is about, I think it's about 40% of the overall trading relationship between Australia and China, isn't really easily weaponizable, if you will, by Beijing. Overall, though, PRC is Australia's top trading partner, whereas the UK, on the other hand, has much less China dependence overall. China is its number 3 trading partner, but it lags far behind the EU and the US. And we've seen sort of evidence of the PRC's recognition of this in that the PRC has been openly using economic coercion against Australia since its call for an international investigation into coronavirus. It's been targeting Australian barley, beef, tourism and education. This hasn't happened so far with the UK, though it has, as I mentioned before, the ambassador has threatened unspecified retaliation following the developments over Hong Kong recently and Huawei. People-to-people contacts has been obviously limited, as everywhere, due to COVID, but a couple of recent developments are relevant, I think. In terms of international education, a recent survey that some of our viewers might have seen carried out among PRC students and parents of outbound overseas students, found only 40 to 50% are saying that they're going to go ahead with their international study plans at this point. In relation to Australia specifically, international students have, I think, been treated pretty shoddily in Australia, not just PRC students, but international students in general. PRC students are about a third of those. They've been treated pretty shoddily. They were excluded from the Australian government's job retention scheme, which meant that a lot of them who were relying on part-time work in the country lost that income stream and didn't have anything to replace it. They're not eligible for state welfare benefits or anything like that. So they left a lot of them kind of abandoned. We saw scenes of sort of long queues of international students queuing up for free meals. And there were even comments from the Prime Minister talking about it's time to go home. So specifically about Australia, in that survey that I mentioned, a lot of the survey's students and parents told the researchers that Australia was not looking like such an attractive destination, in particular due to the Chinese government's, and this relates to the economic coercion question as well. In particular, it was related to one of the most commonly cited reasons was the Chinese government's warnings about COVID and instances of racism. About 40%, I think, of the respondents who'd studied in Australia said that that would be a key consideration in whether they'd return or not. So the question isn't merely whether the PRC students will come back, but where those that do come back actually go. With Australia and the US maybe looking increasingly unfriendly and maybe even troublesome, as we've seen in recent days with the US's visa policies regarding international students. Does that mean that maybe Canada, New Zealand and the UK might expect either stronger student numbers or at least a mitigated impact of COVID as a result of the other English-speaking options looking increasingly unfavourable from a PRC perspective? That's an open question. Just quickly on opinion polls as well, there's been some notable releases of opinion polls recently. In particular, the Lowy Institute's most recent poll showed very clearly that China had a declining favourability towards China in Australia, significant declines China's now dropped 19 points on the 1 to 100 scale thermometer of general friendliness towards China since 2018. And China is now behind Russia in favorability among Australians and ahead only of Iran and Saudi Arabia. Broadly, the UK public appears to be similarly disposed, with 38% had a positive view of China in Pew's most recent poll carried out in December 2019, so that's before the COVID outbreak. And that was already down 10 points from a year earlier. So broadly, similar trends in relation to public opinion in Australia and China, Australia and Britain towards China. So the big question then, what about what Australia and the UK think of US China relations? So in general, I'd say that the UK and Australia are strong advocates of free trade, and so they haven't been fond of the US current administration's trade war. Australia was particularly disappointed at the US's pullout from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and neither country really favours the kind of blunt, generalised competition across sectors that we're seeing from the US. And I think they're all also worried about the current administration's sort of competence in handling potential US-China crisis, the potential that other allies could get dragged in, as well as being worried about the US's own commitments to its alliances, which Donald Trump, the president himself, has done nothing to kind of allay those fears. But as I mentioned before, I think there's elements of the tougher China policy seen in the US that the UK and Australia both do welcome. And I think this is reflected in what they themselves are doing. So we know that Trump's tariffs are unpopular in Australia, but Australia is very clearly looking to diversify its trade profile. This has been seen in its driving of the Five Eyes discussion on economic matters. And there's also an Australian parliamentary inquiry going on right now into diversification of trade. But that's a very different idea to decoupling. This is coming from people like Peter Varghese, a very former senior public servant, who calls decoupling from China sheer folly, but at the same time advocates diversification as an objective to be pursued through more free trade deals with other countries that don't wield the kind of economic leverage that China has shown itself to be willing to. There is also definitely momentum for decoupling in the tech and communications sector, which is obviously an important part of the US's policy. Here, Australia is very tightly aligned to the US, having already acted to essentially prohibit Huawei's participation in 5G, and also mirroring the US's very tight scrutiny of scientific cooperation where there's military potential. Human rights concerns, as in the US, have also come to the fore, and rightly so, on things like collaborations on technologies that could be used in the extreme repression that we're seeing in Xinjiang. So I think the US and Australia are basically with the US on the tech war, but not on the trade war. In terms of the COVID disinformation wars, I think both the Australian and the UK governments have looked on with dismay as the US has seemingly joined the PRC in a race to the bottom over COVID. Australia's coronavirus inquiry proposal that got them into such trouble with the PRC this year, I think one of Australia's motivations was really to provide a better alternative to the US, which was talking about conspiracy theories, Wuhan labs and all of this, weaponized viruses and whatnot. And I think this explains why Australia came out with this proposal urgently without building broad support for it first, and also why they packaged it up in the kind of rhetoric as a kind of anti-China or China-targeted proposal. It was essentially to try to attract the US to that type of proposal and draw and sort of channel the US away from talking about conspiracy theories. So climate change, obviously, it's probably well known that Australians and Brits take climate change very seriously. They want to see the US and China cooperate, and they understand that to be essential to dealing with the problem. So the message there would be that the US can make potentially a new US administration. It's unlikely to happen under the current one, but the US could make major soft power gains in those two countries by returning to a science-based climate policy. And then on human rights, it's also worth noting that targeted sanctions on PRC officials over human rights issues are actually very popular among the publics in these countries. 80+% were in favour of Australia using Magnitsky-style sanctions against PRC officials over human rights abuses in the latest Lowy poll. So from that, we might infer that Washington's Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act or the Uyghur Human Rights Act, Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, are sort of one area where the US's current approach is actually popular with allies, or at least with the public in allied countries. Notably, though, neither the US nor Australia have actually done this themselves, which really underlines how interest-based and calculative countries tend to be over this area of policy. So moving on then to the red line issues. I take a red line to be a sort of speculative question about the issues that could really upend the relationship. And so sort of one question that we have to sort of keep in mind is, you know, how much worse could the Australia-China relationship really become with diplomatic ties essentially frozen, or political ties essentially frozen. But nonetheless, I think Hong Kong and the UK probably have a long way to go, potentially in the deterioration of their ties over that issue. Beijing has blatantly repudiated its UN-registered treaty on Hong Kong that it signed with Britain in 1984, referring to it as nothing more than a historical document, and that's really riled up conservatives here in the UK. We've also seen Beijing repeatedly accusing the UK of interference in China's internal affairs for anything that it says about Hong Kong's situation. So where could this go? The UK's human rights, the UK placed Magnitsky-style sanctions on a number of countries' officials just this week. Russia, Saudi Arabia, North Korea were among them, Myanmar as well. The PRC was no PRC officials were on that list. And so I think that's probably something that's probably intended as a message to Beijing. And that could easily happen if relations continue to deteriorate over that issue. Hong Kong exiles are another thing that the UK will definitely be thinking a lot about over the coming years, because speculatively it's likely there'll be a critical mass of exiled Hong Kongers in the UK doing what they can to undermine Beijing, quite possibly lobbying very effectively in the Parliament and elsewhere, maybe even in the City of London, potentially, you know, affecting the interbank capital supply for PRC banks. So that's something to really keep an eye on, as well as Beijing's obvious intent to impose extraterritorial countermeasures where its interests on things like Hong Kong are threatened. We've seen it with their coercion and suppression of Uyghur communities overseas. And so if the Hong Kong exile community becomes increasingly active in the UK is likely to face the challenge of dealing with the PRC's attempts to interfere with that. And there's very quickly on a couple of major security issues. On the South China Sea, UK and Australia have both talked about stepping up their naval presence and taken some actions that sort of gesture in that direction. That's something that could potentially lead to some kind of incident at sea that could be very unpredictable. But an interesting twist, at least in the Australia case, is the question about US credibility in the decisions that allies like Australia and the UK make in relation to going into these types of areas. The previous Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, in his recently published memoirs, noted explicitly that the reason why he chose not to do freedom of navigation operations in more controversial parts of the South China Sea was that he wasn't sure that the US would show up if there was an incident. Even more interestingly, his reasoning for why that Australia shouldn't patrol, therefore, wasn't simply that Australians would be in harm's way. It was that it might actually reveal the US to the region as being a paper tiger and therefore upend the regional order. And then just lastly on Taiwan, I suspect that in the event of an actual PRC invasion of Taiwan, Australia would probably have little hesitation in joining a US-led response. However, I think the UK would be much less likely to participate in that kind of a military response. Some evidence from that, it comes from some recent, there's very little discussion of the Taiwan issue here in the UK. And what discussion there is sort of talks about what kinds of diplomatic responses the UK would have to make in the event of an extreme PRC action over that issue. So there's another contrast between the UK and Australia. But I'll leave it there, and hopefully I haven't gone too far over time.
Gordon, since you got the least amount of airtime in terms of presentations, let me start with you and see if you have any questions for your fellow panelists, anything that they said that struck you, that commonality or disagreements, or curious about your reactions to them.
Sure, I'll come right at one topical issue, which is Hong Kong. Place where I've lived a few times. I went to college there, had a daughter born there, I'm very fond of that city. It's a wonderful place with a foot in two cultures. But having said that, for Canada, it's a very important place. I mentioned that our troops fought there. We have 300,000 Canadians living there. I think that's more than any other nationality. We have over 1 million, we're a population of 37 million, so we have over 1 million Canadians who have family roots in Hong Kong, lots of Canadian institutions there, etc. So this has the potential. I'm not minimizing the two Michaels. That's a red line issue for Canada. There can be no solution to the relationship problems without the two Michaels being solved. But I worry about the Hong Kong situation. In my view, if the demonstrators in Hong Kong had stuck with the Martin Luther King methodology, large-scale peaceful marches, candlelight vigils, I do not actually think that the PRC would have proceeded with the security law and with where we now find ourselves. I could be wrong on that, I just have a sense. The vandalizing of the LegCo and violence in the streets, then mirrored by the police, of course, I think pushed China into a position from which it's not going to back down. There is, in my view, not one chance in a billion that they're going to pull that legislation. But for my panelists, I would say, we, Canada, are going to be now in that mire of the Hong Kong situation, which has a very good possibility of becoming more difficult for us, with lots of domestic support in Canada for hardline Hong Kong. What about Germany, Australia, and UK? Are they as immersed in this issue as is Canada?
Great question, Gordon. I wish I could give you an answer. There have been several comments, both from German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, and also from the German Chancellor, very strongly speaking against the new security law, obviously. But as far as I can see, there have been mostly internal discussions at this point in preparation of the EU summit, and I was also struck by Andrew's comments about the Magnitsky sanctions. I'm not aware of any similar discussions in Germany at the moment. So I don't know, Andrew, what do you think about Australia and the UK?
Yeah, I'd go back to what I mentioned in the brief presentation, which was that really the Hong Kongers overseas are the crucial population, because I think broadly the populations in Australia and the UK are sympathetic, certainly to the plight of Hong Kongers. They understand their democratic aspirations, and they can probably put themselves in their shoes fairly easily and imagine what it would be like. Staring down the barrel of 25 years time, we are officially going to be a normal part of China, and it looks on the current trends like that's happening sort of ahead of schedule. So I think there's broad-based support among those populations, but I think what really is most crucial is how Hong Kongers overseas adopt their strategies and adapt their strategies to the new circumstances that they face in terms of the restrictions within Hong Kong itself. I think they've opened up a lot of channels through which they can quite smartly inject their views into the policy-making process. And they've certainly got some strong advocates in the parliament on both counts. Not necessarily just the sort of, they've certainly got the China hawk constituencies within the parliaments on their side, but they also have a lot of allies within broader society and also more broadly across the political spectrum. Just because I think that's been largely a function of the coverage of the issue has been very vivid, very dramatic, and has made it very easy for people to understand and empathize with the situation of Hong Kongers. So I do think that that's likely to be something that features prominently in both of those countries' relations with China going forward.
So Sophie Richardson, who's head of sort of Asia for Human Rights Watch, wrote in the State Department and Treasury Department and announced earlier today that global Magnitsky sanctions are being placed on 4 Chinese officials and an entity for human rights violation in Xinjiang. And that then relates to a question sent in by Tom Watkins. What should our nations do to address issues around cultural genocide that appear to be well documented around the Uyghur people? And how do we collectively as nations address this issue? Because China clearly sees any type of our doing so as interference in their internal affairs. So whether it's Uyghur issues or the new security law in Hong Kong, is there any possibility of countries either these days probably not under a U.S.-led coalition, but any other sort of making a dent with the Chinese on these issues? Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I misspoke or wasn't clear before, but the point I was making before was actually that the Australians and the British have not imposed any kind of Magnitsky-style targeted sanctions on PRC officials yet. But I do think that that is something that's very much on the agenda. It's something that people are pushing for. It's something that arguably could be in that red line category because it would really rile up the PRC, I believe. But nonetheless, I think that the targeted sanctions, I think there's an academic literature out there that indicates that targeted sanctions can work and that they don't have the kind of side effects that the usual sort of blunt sanctions that we sort of saw in the 1990s have on civilian populations. So I think that is an appropriate policy option. And as far as implementation goes, I think the US has been out in front probably for its own reasons, but nonetheless, I think it's entirely possible that other countries would in fact follow the US's lead on that front.
If I could add just a couple of words, Canada has parallel legislation modeled actually on the US legislation. We are profoundly influenced by what happens in the United States. The challenge with dealing with China is, for Canada, number one, we have our hands full with the 2 Michaels and the unraveling Hong Kong situation. There's been a reluctance for that reason, in my view, to make a final decision on Huawei, although it's hard for me to imagine us approving Huawei in any meaningful participation in 5G, given the current circumstances. But the other issue, and I'd argue, particularly for smaller countries, there is no NATO in Asia. And I'm not suggesting it would be easily done. There are too many cultural differences and political differences between potential members, such as South Korea and Japan. But when there is just informal collaboration, which there is, certainly, behind closed doors, between foreign ministries, it leaves lots of doors open for China to single out individual countries. And as noted, and I'm not here to criticize anything in the United States, a country which I have greatest admiration But when the current U.S. administration devalues existing alliances and doesn't appear to value them highly, that reduces the incentive and the options for collective action. And individually, yes, Canada could bring out a whole smorgasbord of Magnitsky issues, although I would note, in such a highly centralized country such as China, I believe that President Xi Jinping was personally involved in the decision to detain the two Michaels. I'm certain that Xi Jinping was directly involved and gave a green light to the security. So you may choose to go for bit players, but one challenge of those sanctions is if you really want to go to the people ultimately responsible, you'd have to then sanction the highest level of the Chinese Communist Party. And the reaction, I think, is predictable, and we would dive deeper into a dysfunctionality between the West and China. I'm not saying we won't end up there, but I think we should have a deep breath and be collectively engaged before we march off that cliff, to mix my metaphors. Thank you.
So I would say Germany's approach has been less confrontational, perhaps, and trying to promote more open conversations between China and Germany and also Europe. And the way Germany is doing this is more informally. So I had the chance to observe how this works in practice when I was traveling with the German Bundespräsident. And during the official policy making or policy talks, of course, any time human rights are being raised, of course, doesn't seem to lead anywhere. But then we were invited at the National Hall of the People for a state banquet. And during the banquet, Xi Jinping and Frank-Walter Steinmeier, they were sitting beside each other. And usually during these banquets, apparently, Xi Jinping gets up pretty early. And as soon, of course, as Xi Jinping gets up, my seating neighbors at the tables were telling me, of course, everybody has to get up and leave and stop eating immediately. Well, during this particular meeting, we continued to even have tea and dessert, which was very unusual. And at some point, the whole room fell silent, and we were all looking at the table, and we were observing Steinmeier and Xi Jinping in deep conversation, of course, with their translators. And later on, I learned that they had been talking about Xinjiang. And the argument that Steinmeier has made was rather than stopping any conversation about Xinjiang, China should open conversation and talk about its own approach. And Xi Jinping, of course, with Germany, has a particular interest in promoting very positive relationship and using the U.S.-China trade war as an opportunity to pull Germany more into the Chinese direction. And so he was, obviously he was very interested. And just 3 weeks later, I have observed YouTube videos in Chinese and English with English subtitles being circulated on YouTube that were trying to frame. They were making interviews with people working and participating in camps in Xinjiang. And the framing of these so-called documentaries were very much with the Chinese framing at the time, which was that Xinjiang, ethnic minorities in Xinjiang were proposing a security threat, and that terrorists were basically seen as terrorists, and that the camps were trying to help to address a terrorist issue. So I would say that the German approach is more to focus more on informal meetings, on building trust and trying to opening conversation rather than moving towards more confrontation.
In terms of what could be done about Xinjiang, I think it doesn't just happen on the level of policymakers. I think that there's things that people can do in civil society in terms of making sure that they're not in any way supporting the systems of repression that have been implemented in that part of the world and indeed in other places. There's scope to, I think, introduce more robust systems of ethical review in research, research project. There's been a few projects that have been identified as potentially contributing to repression and systems of surveillance and repression in Xinjiang, as well as a number of brands that have been identified as potentially having, being complicit in the use of labor of incarcerated Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So that's the type of thing that can happen actually below the level of, state policy.
Well, I just thank you for that, Andrew. And Danny, the way you answered your addendum to that last question, I think answers the question that we had from Rick Nyo of Star Industries, who had written in asking if German policies would outlast the tenure of Chancellor Merkel. And from what you said, it sounds like the answer is yes, they would, that the Germans, at least German government across the board, is concerned about these issues and wants to continue a non-confrontational policy, but raising it at a private level as opposed to publicly. Is that?
Yeah, I would agree with that also, of course, because the German economy is so much also dependent on positive relations with China, which then will promote some consistency and stability. But I have to say that the German Chancellor Merkel, she has already announced that she will not stand for run for office in 2021. And the current grand coalition between the Social Democrats and the Conservatives is only having a marginal majority at the moment. So we're going to see how elections will develop in 2021.
Well, that sort of gets me to a question. Andrew, in one of your slides, you talked about the deep decline in favorability among the general publics in both the UK and Australia vis-a-vis China. And I'm just wondering, Danny and Gordon, in Germany and in Canada, you may not have the exact statistics, but does that track as well? Is on the people-to-people level, is favorability toward China on a decline or not?
Go ahead, Daniela, I'll follow.
Yeah, so the German population tends to view Chinese politics through a historical lens, mostly looking at it from our own historical memories based on Nazi Germany and also of the East German surveillance state. So because of that, Germany has always been fairly critical of China as a political nation, but of course people's responses differ if you ask questions about Chinese culture and also about China's economic development, I would say.
And I'd add from the Canadian perspective, traditionally, views of Canadians towards China have been more positive than in the United States. We would have established diplomatic relations with China well before 1970. We were the first of the Western nations after France and Britain, for particular reasons, to establish relations earlier. But we led a wave of other countries. We would have done so earlier. It was only when Henry Kissinger and President Nixon began that opening, that strategic opening to China, that we then moved forward swiftly. Fast forward to the 1989 relations of China, positive views of China deteriorated sharply and never fully recovered again. But then with the arrest of the two Canadians, those views have fallen off a cliff. And I think of all of the countries represented here, we have the lowest now. 14% of Canadians have a positive view of China. That's worse even than the United States by when I most recently checked those numbers. And I cannot see, particularly with Hong Kong, any prospect of that improving. We're a small country, but we can be stubborn. And with two of our citizens stuck there in unjust imprisonment, in my view, the Canadian public will not let loose of that bone until they're free. And I've had people say, well, what if China puts on more economic pressure? We're small, but we're stubborn. And that relationship will be stuck where it is until our Canadians come home.
My question to Gordon was the question of diversification of trade profile. I mentioned a couple of things that Australia is doing in that direction. Has Canada started actually doing anything on that front?
Such a good question. And again, we are cursed with the best market right next door. I mean that as a joke, because our prosperity hinges we're literally sewed together. People go across the U.S. border to fill a tank of gasoline or to buy groceries, or vice versa. And that relationship has sustained for over 100 years our prosperity. It's absolutely essential to our country. But we discovered during the Great Recession that even that remarkable access has its limitations. If the U.S. economy stumbles, then it affects us. So multiple governments have said, well, let's diversify. China's our number 2 trading partner, 5%. I look at Australia with envy, because you've got a basket. You want to diversify. You already got significant trade relationships with China, Japan, US, and Europe, far more balanced than are we. So yes, we want to diversify. And now with the TPP having gone forward, we have some advantages even over US agricultural exports in particular. So we'll do better in the Japan market than we've done before. India is not an easy market to penetrate, despite the fact we've got much in common. Europe, all due respect to the EU, it's not easy either, partly because they have very high standards, also because they're also a significant degree of protection. So we need the WTO. We're a country that really needs global trading rules that are open, because we don't have the stick to bring to a bilateral meeting to force others to back down. We need universal trade values. So yes, governments will continue to push forward, but the reality is there is no substitute for the United States. If the US economy goes into recession, which appears likely, we will suffer. When it booms again, we will prosper mightily.
I hesitate to wade into American politics, but how important do you feel it is to have a change of administrations, or how would you see a Biden administration versus a Trump administration changing the way your country's dealt with China going forward?
I'm hesitant to interfere in the internal affairs of the United States of America.
Wise answer.
All I'll say is that the views towards President Trump in Australia and Britain are pretty well known. They show up in opinion polling and they show up in official comments as well. I think that the principal difference that a Biden administration would make is that it would create a whole new set of channels and opportunities for coordination of these what appear to inevitably be tougher China policies, but it'd be tougher and more coordinated China policies likely under a Biden administration that placed a higher value on the alliances.
I am hesitant to speak for my country, especially since I've been spending 20 years away from Germany. So I will just talk about my personal view and my personal observations. So as a China scholar, I have always been very skeptical of arguments supporting the rise of China. But as a result of the developments both in China as well as in the United States during the pandemic and the government's reactions to them, I have now become convinced as a China scholar that China's rise is coming and that we are currently observing China rising and the decline of the United States. And the decline of the United States, and this is also me speaking as a China scholar, as somebody who has been studying the decline of the Qing dynasty, which was accompanied with lots of protests and internal chaos and conflict. I see actually many similarities now happening in the United States, and the Trump administration is certainly promoting more conflict than promoting stability. Whether a Biden administration would be a better choice, I leave that up to American citizens to decide what the best route would be to go about stabilizing the country and therefore also stabilizing global politics.
I'll jump in.
The last word to the diplomat.
Well, I once represented my country, but I do so no longer. I've regained my voice. And I think I said during the test earlier, I have a very strong positive view of Americans. I don't have to decide whether the R word or the D word. I just like Americans. But to be frank, you have the first president since World War II who hasn't put strong stake in allies. And we sense that keenly of disregard. And I think that's some of that damage is remedial, can be remedied, and some cannot. And I think that particularly for parts of Europe may, well, to some extent, drift in their own direction. For Canada, we have no choice. Again, we're joined at the hip. We must have a strong, positive relationship. And that's why you've seen our Prime Minister stop short of any direct criticism. Although I will say, and when President Trump called Prime Minister Trudeau dishonest and weak publicly, more Canadians voted for the opposition leader in the last election. Like the Prime Minister lost the popular vote. But the reaction of Canadians was rally around the flag. Again, we're small but stubborn. I think that was not wise. And I think typically U.S. administrations, even if they were unhappy with our prime ministers, and that has occurred, they took a bigger view of U.S. interests. And one of the great strategic advantages of the United States since formation of NATO has been strong allies. It means you don't have to fight every war alone. You have coalitions that can come under the U.S. leadership, fight in places like Afghanistan, in Korea, and that's less certain now. As to the longevity of the United States versus China, I think we're going to have a trilateral world for a long time. EU doesn't have as coherent a foreign policy or a military, but the EU is not, I'm confident in the United States that it will persist. It's going through a weak period. It has some strengths. It has, Silicon Valley is a towering monument to US creativity and the proper use of capital. I spent the first part of my career during the Cold War. Soviet Union looked awfully tough too, but I'd say it was the strength of iron, not of steel. There was a fragility in the leadership system, which may still apply to China. The US, like many democratic countries, like Germany, like Australia, like Canada, is a bit more like bamboo. Or it can give, and it pushes in one direction or the other, but it has an ability to recover and bounce back. So I'll declare myself an optimist for the United States. China is returning to its role as a leading world power. It's not a new thing. It's an old thing. It's been around there are always intermissions for a couple of years during the late Qing, as you know, as was referred to by Daniela. But we're going to have to live with a powerful China. We will have, in my view, fortunately, a powerful United States, and we'll have a powerful Europe.